if and when you want me to open cameras. And then we can, allow other people to ask questions too. I see we have some experts also joining us today. So
Great.
Be an interesting conversation, not necessarily in this field, but adjacent fields.
Oh, wonderful.
So with your permission,
Okay,
I'll
great.
say, on behalf of the American Sephardi Federation Institute of Jewish Experience, and on behalf of the Rabbi Arthur Schneier International Program of Yeshiva University, we are really happy to welcome you, Dr. Albert, today. Thank you for joining us. Do you go by Orovitz Albert or?
Albert's fine. Thank you.
So thank you for joining us today. For those who are in attendance, your microphones and cameras are off for now. We will invite you to turn them on about halfway through, probably. So if you want to ask questions, you can put them right now into chat. If any of you have seen the book already or any of you have thoughts on it, throw them into the chat. We'll be monitoring it. This is a conversation. This is not a formal presentation. So we really do encourage you to please ask your questions, talk, challenge, make it an interesting conversation. That's our goal for today.
Maybe not too much.
No.
Just kidding.
You can have it. I will give the floor over to Professor Roddy Perlis.
Thank you. It's really great to be here together. I've known Anne for a very long time. Thank God we were in Philadelphia at the same time when she was starting her PhD, and got to know each other at the library, at the Cat Center, over coffee, and really, it's really been wonderful throughout our careers to be in touch with each other and learn from each other. And I can tell everyone that you're here, sitting here with someone who thinks deeply, who thinks very carefully, writes beautifully, and really we're going to learn a lot today. So I'm really excited for this. And I'll do the formal introduction. And Orovitz Albert is the Klatt Family Director for Public Programs at the Herbert D. Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. And for those of you who don't know what the Katz Center is, I'll say a little something, just as someone who's not partisan. I've never been a formal fellow, but the Katz Center is in beautiful Center City, Philadelphia, on, I believe, Walnut Street or Chestnut Street, one of the tree streets, and it has an incredibly important collection of Judaica. The librarians there have always been incredible resources for scholars all over the world. And every year they host a very special thematic year of in-depth study where scholars from all over the world come and discuss and do further research in that theme, the theme that they choose for that year. I think upcoming it's going to be health, right? Jews and health or something like that.
This coming year that starts now is on music. Actually.
Oh, right. This year's music, they call for papers.
And the year after is on health and medicine. Yeah. So.
Yes. So, and they do wonderful public programs that Anne can tell us more about. And but it's a bedrock place where scholars related to so many different areas of Jewish studies have benefited and have been able to really come up with great ideas. And since the fellows are there together for so long, they generate real conversation. It's really, to be at a seminar there as a scholar, you really see scholarship at its best, where people are really learning, challenging, growing with each other. So it's a wonderful thing. So without further ado, let's get to the book. And I thought of a way to just think about maybe talking about if you can present some of the basic ideas of the book.
Wait, let's first, we didn't even say the name of the book yet. So.
Right, I didn't say. I'm sorry, it was on the title, Jewish Politics in Spinoza's Amsterdam. And that's my question, which is maybe you could, it's a very succinct title. It's nice, it doesn't have one of those, no colons. It stands on its own. But if you could maybe parse those terms, because I think the way you use them is specific, very specific and very enlightening. And, so Jewish politics, Spinoza's Amsterdam, you can do it in whatever order you want, but maybe, so, and we can start with that and then we can see where we go.
Yeah. Amazing. Thank you so much. Maybe I'll just start by saying, first of all, thank you guys for inviting me to come and chat about this. It's really exciting. It's always just a pleasure, I think, after you've put yourself so deeply inside a project for a long time, to have anybody who just even wants to hear you rant about it. So it's like lovely. Okay, so I have to say, I really didn't want a post-colon in the title of the book, so I did that on purpose. I wanted to be clean, but I also know that it is a little opaque. The post-colon, if I had had one, probably would have been the community as commonwealth. So now I'll expand on all of that, or envisioning the community as commonwealth. What the book does basically is explore, reveal, take up a set of ideas, of Jewish political ideas that emerged largely in the second half of the 17th century in the era of Spinoza, among essentially his cohort, right? His former peers, the people who were around in the community before and after his excommunication, and at the moment that he was publishing and beginning to gain notoriety. So framing the project in terms of Spinoza, like calling it Spinoza's Amsterdam, is a kind of a subtle signal that the ideas that we're taking up there are ideas that he was also interested in, and that the people that we're looking at, even though they didn't share a community with him anymore at that time, were deeply enmeshed with the same discourses and assumptions and political and cultural contexts that he was. So the overarching project is to take up these political ideas, and the ideas that they had were to interpret or to reinterpret the community, the diaspora Jewish, self-governed, lay-led, sort of administrative, corporate society community in political terms, and to think of it and interpret it and argue about it and operate in it in ways that they saw explicitly as being parallel to Christian politics, parallel to Christian states. So we can talk about this again in a minute if you want to ask again about the word politics and how I'm using it, but essentially that they wanted to see their community actively in political terms and to put politics at the heart of how they understood themselves. So backing up a little bit, when I started the project, I started out more or less by looking for instances of Jewish thinkers who were responding to the political thought of the age. So I knew that the Spanish and Portuguese Jews of Amsterdam, who were former conversos, returned conversos, who had many of them lived lives as Catholics, as conversos in Iberia, even those who hadn't were still connected to that world. I knew that they were sophisticated, that they were worldly, they were well-informed, they were connected to all dimensions of the world around them, they were fashionable, right? And I also knew that the place that they went to, this Amsterdam in the middle of the 17th century, was nearly ground zero of the birth of the modern state and modern political thought, right? So from Hobbes to Locke to Spinoza, from the English Civil War to the Glorious Revolution in 1688, this Anglo-Dutch political context is where we see the formation of like modern liberal democracy, the rise of Western concept of the state in the West. So these are people who should have been aware of all that, thinking about all of that, and responding to all of that. That was my hypothesis. I was like, okay, I'm going to look for places where they talk about Hobbes or whatever. I thought I would find those things. And another clue was Spinoza, right? So his political thought was very much of its time, was very much responding to Hobbes and really beat at the heart of early modern political thought, but was typically treated as being really apart from the kinds of questions and concerns that his fellow or his former fellow Jews had at the time, etc. So I was looking for those things, and what I found in the end was, yes, they did respond, they did talk about it, they did refer to these figures, but I think something even deeper was that, as I said, there was an effort in that final, or in the second third of the century, to really put questions of how Jews can be political and what kind of polity Jews can and do have, and what Judaism and Jewish life are in political terms, put those questions at the heart of their activities and their self-image. Okay, that's sort of what it does. In terms of like scholarly interventions, there's just a few overarching things. One is it really takes up and explores, I think, from a lot of different directions, a new way of thinking about the question of what kinds of politics Jews and Judaism have or ought to have, right? It also shows Jews responding to and adopting, taking up, and really like using and transforming for themselves critical elements of the new politics of the 17th century, which I think we haven't seen before. It also shows a different kind of relationship to Spinoza and what Spinoza was interested in, so it sheds new light on that relationship. And then there's another whole piece, which is that I think it also shows a new dimension of how Sabbatianism was understood and how its aftermath played out. So when I talk about all of this in terms of Spinoza, it's actually only one part of how I understand this historical moment. The sources, so I looked at sources from across the century. The ones that engage in this kind of active political questioning and assertion of Jewish political identity essentially all fall within like 2.5 decades, from the early 1660s to the mid 1680s. Okay, that's coterminous with like Spinoza's working time. It's also right around, it's the time of Spinoza and its aftermath, the immediate aftermath, when the question of Jewish political resurgence was a present one. And so one intervention is to think about the ways in which communal disputes and communal discourse about politics were refracting that question of Jewish political restoration. I'll stop there because I know that's already a lot.
That's a lot, and I still think we need to unpack the term politics.
Yeah.
So
Do
if
you
you
want me to talk about
could,
that?
yeah, you've used that a lot, and
Yeah.
even in the book, it keeps coming up, and
Yeah,
I think it needs to be.
totally. Okay, so the way that I'm using it is really in a narrow sense of being related to government, formal institutions, and offices to organize and control people and money and processes, right? So it's really related to the classical meaning of a polity. So things that go on in a polity, or what we would now call a state.
Right.
And I'm not using it in the wider sense that I think that we tend to have naturally now when we talk about like, oh, how crazy politics are today, or, oh, that's all political, right? A lot of times when we talk about politics, we just talk about people vying for power, or making claims and making deals and competing to wield influence or to get positions, right? Those things are related because those are activities that reflect the process of working within a political system, right? But what I'm referring to is the quality of having a political system, or thinking of what you do as being part of a polity at all. So there's all kinds of other things that we think of like as political, like we think of like gender as being political, or some kinds of speech as being political, or who belongs to our group as being a kind of political stance, right? And that's really valid. And in fact, a lot of the work that has taken place in this field of Jewish political studies or Jewish political tradition is, with some notable exceptions, is to a great extent taking this contemporary notion of what politics is, right? That it's this like vying for power and use of power, and can include all of these different dimensions. It's taking that contemporary understanding of politics and looking for places where Jews did those things or thought about those things in the past. It's great. It's real. We have an understanding of what politics is. But I also argue that it's anachronistic to suggest, again, there are exceptions, but in most cases, anachronistic to suggest that the Jews in a particular setting would have understood what they were doing as political in that way. And then what's new in this context is that Jews are adapting a new understanding of a polity and of what constitutes the political that gives them an opportunity to apply it to them. Okay, what do I mean by that? We have learned from really a generation or a two's worth of scholarship, beginning with the work of Quentin Skinner and John Pocock, that the 17th century was a time when this expansive and sort of generic category of the polity or the political first emerged in precisely this context of Anglo-Dutch political thought. So the argument there is that the notion of the republic shifted as it was adapted to, for example, the British context or the English context, shifted from being a word that specifically denoted some kind of government that didn't have a monarch, but instead was ruled by the people, and instead came to mean something generic like any kind of government, any kind of body of people that were joined together under a binding authority. That's what this word came to mean, republica or republic. And so in the English context, it's typically translated as commonwealth. It has a particular local meaning of joining together of people under an authority because they have shared interests, whether they're financial or religious or any kind of other shared interest. That's the common of the commonwealth. And in other contexts, it's translated. So what Pocock suggests is that we should call it a polity because it's a better translation of this generic idea than republic, which to us connotes no monarch. So what we've seen actually is that over the course of the 17th and then into the 18th centuries, a new space for thinking of oneself as having binding governmental authority emerges that is not dependent on any specific form, and rather a sense of politics as being a universal, commonly held, generic sphere or mode of human life basically comes into being in this context. And that's what Jews are able to take up. They're able to say, politics, having a state, having a polity, having a mutual agreement that has formed, an authority that we now have to obey and that organizes our lives and our finances, that's having a polity. So that's politics and that's political. And that's what they're taking up. And I think that when you start combing out the implications of that, you find that in that moment is born a lot of additional questions about what it means for Jews to have that after exile.
So in other words, the idea that they can see themselves as political. They can see themselves like a mini state within themselves, even though they obviously don't have an army and they don't have control over all sorts of other external things, but that they can come together.
Right. So a really significant thing about the idea of the commonwealth or the polity in this moment is that it's going to become the idea of the modern state, right? This is the category of thing that will become state. But in this moment, it doesn't require sovereignty yet. Like a commonwealth or a republic can be a subset. In fact, very commonly is understood as a sort of subunit of something else.
Can you give us an
example? It has authority, but it's not sovereign, which means that a Jewish community looks a lot like that.
Can you give us a non-Jewish example of one of those things which are not states, but they were still seen as commonwealths? Absolutely.
Like an English city commonwealth is an example. So a city would organize itself into a self-conscious and binding governmental body that had certain rights and privileges granted by the monarch or the lord or whoever was immediately above it, that were then respected in their own right. And the members of it and the subjects of it understood themselves as being first and foremost part of that commonwealth. that's specific to a commonwealth. Actually, also the individual states and sometimes even cities within the Dutch Republic were sometimes treated in that way as commonwealths unto themselves. So you talk about, so Spinoza, who is obviously writing in Latin and using the word republic, it's very often translated as using the word commonwealth. So when he talks about like the Dutch Republic, he often says commonwealth. The understanding is this is what he's referring to. Another example actually in a Spanish context is using the word república in this same way to refer to like the República de los Indios. So there would be like sort of politically bound bodies of natives who formed their own unit, right? Certainly not a sovereign state,
Right.
but also something that has its own character and quality as a political entity and standing.
And you talk about it as a Jewish polity, and there's this religion and politics kind of interplay in there, and you talk about people being invited in and not invited in, what are the spaces where you're allowed in, and that there's a ban on creating a minyan outside of the synagogue, the main synagogue. So how is that line navigated?
Yeah, so the line becomes really troublesome to them, essentially. I mean, the reason why I talk about it a lot is because what you see happening is that once they adopt this category of polity, they also now have to figure out what is the relationship between the polity and the religion, which is the same debate that Christians are having, right? So for example, so two examples. One example is the question of what is the role of a rabbi and rabbinic law in relation to this Jewish polity, right? And fundamentally, the way that their community is set up is that rabbis and rabbinic law have little to do with the what do I want to say? The core functioning of the entity that is the community. So the community is understood as being authorized or empowered, like put into place through the authority of its people who have signed a constitution saying that they'll give over authority to this entity called the Kadosh Talmud Torah. And the authority that they constituted together is turned over to a group of lay leaders, and those lay leaders hold office, and they have swear loyalty to their duties running the community, and they operate very fundamentally in lay modes. Now, that is not to say that it's like a totally lay situation, because in the background, the rationale for authorizing that, for constituting the authority of the lay leaders is rabbinically understood. So if you only read the Constitution, right, the 1639 document that gives power to the Ma'amad and sets the rabbis as, the Ma'amad being the lay leaders, that gives power to the lay leaders and sets the rabbis as sort of employees who are doing some of the work of the community. If you only read that, there are few clues to why they think this is the right way to set up a community, why they think this is an appropriate amount of authority to give to lay leaders, what they understand the rationale to be. But happily, we have the document from 40 years later, written by Yitzhak Abba de Fonseca, who was in 1680 the senior rabbi of the community. And he was actually in 1680, he was the only remaining alive of the original 4 rabbis who were present when the Constitution was created. And that actually becomes a significant point in the argumentation over this. But in 1680, he's forced to respond to a set of congregants who are making principled arguments that they ought to be able to secede from the community because the Constitution is no longer valid. And so there's evidence in his treatise from this year that in that moment, there was a sort of public community discourse about what is the Constitution and why do we have to obey it? What power does it have over me or over you? And from Aboab's argumentation, you can see that the shared understanding of why and how people have given their authority over to the lay leaders has to do with this idea of a minyan, has to do with the inherent authority understood to inhere in a group of 10 ritually eligible adult men. Okay, so I don't want to get too into the weeds, but it's like it's based on a treatment of the cherem by Nachmanides that they're perpetuating, and the idea, and really expanding on. And the idea is that the cherem, that 10 men can create a cherem. The way that they understand this is not that 10 men can ban someone else, but that 10 men form together a bond to obey the body, like to obey the group, right? So that 10 men together, like creating a cherem means creating governing authority for the 10 or more men who have bound themselves together in that cherem. And that's the basis of the idea of what's tying the community together. So they say, well, I made my own minyan. I took 10 men and created a polity over here. So that's just as legitimate, right? So they have an argument back and forth between the rabbi and these secessionists based on a shared understanding of this rabbinic underpinning of the Constitution. Okay, so that's one way in which religion, it's underneath, right? So it's a lay mode, and all the conversations, they're like echoing Hobbes in this argument, but they're also basing it on a sense of what's also halachically or rabbinically legitimate.
So they want almost a halakhic conceptual basis for having a lay-led community. Is that
they have one? Basically, what I'm saying is that is what they set up in 1639, even though the rabbinic justification isn't written in the Constitution. But what's clear from 1680 is that they, at that point, understand that that's the justification. They all believe it. So what they're arguing over is not whether that's the justification. They're arguing over who's right and what do you do with the fact that that's the justification. And then there's an argument that the current lay leadership has broken the contract by not following at least one or two of the components of the Constitution. And so then what do? They say, well, the Ma'amad broke the contract. This is the right of rebellion. And Aboab says, no, once a government is in place, it would be chaos if you could just overturn it. The government remains in place and you just seek redress. So anyway, so this is the complex way in which, okay, so this is the first example, is the way in which the religious underpins this kind of lay functioning of the community. Then there's a question of what role the rabbi ought to have. And that's a whole additional conversation that the argumentation in 1680, again, revolves around whether or not rabbinic imprimatur is required to validate that cherem that's created underneath. Okay, so a number of people who are trying to secede actually look like they want greater rabbinic involvement. So these aren't people who are like, I want to get out of the Jewish community. You know, I'm kind of cosmopolitan. I don't really want to do all this stuff that the rabbis are making me do. Like, we have an impression that this community is, and it's true, many people are on its margins and are struggling to some extent with coming into alignment with the expectations of living an open and halachic Jewish life. But the people who are trying to leave the community in 1680 and engaging in these debates are not, I think, those people. These people are ones who are, on principle, seeking a Jewish community that has a greater role for the rabbi and for halakha. And Abuab has to respond by saying, no rabbis needed. This is inherent in the group of 10 people. And if you require a rabbi, then that gives a rabbi an unreasonable, he says, absurd amount of power in any local context, right? So he says, but, of course there's a but, a rabbi who has been made an official of that Jewish polity of the Republic, now he's an official and he's part of the government, and now his approval is needed if that's part of the government process, right? So it's also, then what he achieves by that is to say that he's the one who matters, and an external rabbi has no right to say anything, right? But you can see that, so it's in the way that politics are all the time. There's the high and the low mixing up, right? There's people trying to achieve their own ends, but they're also talking in a very high register about ideas, about the meaning of a constitution and whether it's eternal, and whether a rabbi is a part of a polity, right? Or whether a cleric is part of a polity, and what is the meaning of excommunication and where does it come from, right? So they're doing both those things at the same time.
As you're talking, I don't want to get into it. I just putting out there that the references that you can make to Israel today based on what you're saying, it was just going through my head. That's a whole nother talk. I'm just throwing out that little thing.
You're welcome to throw it out. I will say, I mean, we don't need to get into the Israeli politics, but for sure, I think that this is a moment when many of the sort of paradigms that have shaped Jewish politics and religion and the way that they connect, and the idea of the way that Jewish politics should be in the world, that many of those paradigms took form. And so,
Can you give an example?
Yeah, like for me also, I always have in the back of my mind contemporary issues. And I think that you see them in many ways in this material.
Like, what's an example of that? Can you give us like an example that you can see that play out?
Yeah, so, okay, so one example is that, so the easy and obvious example, I think, is the question of if there's a Jewish state that's not the biblical polity, right? And it's a Jewish state in which the sort of religious conception of exile still exists, then what should law be, right? And what is the basis for the authority of either religious law or lay law? How is that determined? Okay, like this is very much present in Israel. I feel like that's what Dora was.
Yeah, a rabbi is part of the whole polity.
Right,
That's
right.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's just astounding to hear a rabbi arguing against the importance of rabbis, kind of. At the end, he adds in a very important caveat, but the point is,
okay, it's me.
It's
I mean, it can be, look, like I framed that a certain way, which was like he thinks rabbis aren't important, but the flip side of it is he's saying a rabbi can be an arm of the state. I mean, that's the other side of it, right? And what in the book, what I focus on is the fact that also among Christians who were in this moment having battles over the relationship between church and state, the idea of the role of a religious authority, of a cleric, also often revolved around the question of excommunication in particular, because excommunication is this place where the spiritual meets the social, which you can also kind of read social as political, right?
Right.
And so it becomes, so for Christian thinkers, excommunication as a topic becomes a sort of locus for larger conversations about religious versus governmental or religious versus political authority. And, in one of these sort of like amazing, like pre-modern Jewish Christian like overlaps, those Christian thinkers were often turning to what they understood of the Jewish past to understand Christian excommunication. So they're like bringing the rabbi. So they're like reading Maimonides and reading the Talmud to try to understand excommunication. And then these Jewish figures are seeing them do that. And in a parallel way, trying to apply those questions to their polity. But it's really hard because their polity is in some way continuous with the biblical one, as opposed to having superseded it in the Christian, as the Christians imagine themselves to have done. So they have an additional layer of difficulty in applying this, in sort of using the biblical situation as a model.
Right. So you're saying, like, especially among the Protestants, this kind of move to look at the Old Testament as a model is complicated because so much of their theology is about being superseding the Old Testament, right? And calling it old and calling it, right? Is that where you're getting at?
Okay. So one thing I haven't even like talked about yet is that the 17th century and the 16th to a lesser extent is also a moment of Christians turning to the Bible, and particularly to the what they see as the Jewish history in the Bible, for models of how politics should be, right? And this is part and parcel of their internal turmoil about religion and politics, because one of the most common way of thinking about what the biblical Jewish polity offers is that it's the ideal scenario where religion and politics are enmeshed together, because divine law and human law are the same. There's no difference according to their argumentation. They're combined. So back and forth on different sides, Christians are saying, like, that's ideal, and here's how that should look in a Christian context. Okay, but it's easier for Christians to do that in a way, because they can simply look at that and say, that's an ideal way to be. Now here in my context in 1650 England, I can make my institutions parallel to those. But for Jews who already see their institutions as being in some way continuous with and disrupted from that context, there's an added layer. This is what I mean by there's an added layer of complexity. So for Christians, it's easy to say, like, the content of the law is not relevant anymore. It's the structural system of the relationship between different kinds of law that we can emulate. But for Jews who see maybe that the biblical polity has been, or the laws of the biblical polity have been transformed into rabbinic law that has a very different way of operating and a different content, then what do you do with that? And they, in the book, I talk about some different approaches that they take to think about what to do with it.
So you refer to it as Spinoza's Amsterdam. I want to touch upon that because he's like the poster child of cherem, and I know, but can you just address that a little bit? You call it Spinoza, and we all think of Spinoza as cherem, and you note that there were other people that were in cherem too. He definitely wasn't the only one. What do you think makes it Spinoza's Amsterdam?
I'm not sure that I would say it was Spinoza's Amsterdam. I think I would say I'm calling attention to a dimension of Amsterdam that was Spinoza's. Maybe I'll put it like that. So Spinoza, setting aside even like his relationship to this community, the content of the theological political treatise is right at the center of all the things that I was just talking about. So the theological political treatise is not addressed to Jews. It's not speaking to Jews. It's speaking to a wider audience, probably of Christians in the Dutch Republic, about the ideal relationship between religion and politics, and the ideal way to have a commonwealth, what it means to have one. And he, like many Christians, is looking to the Bible for those models, right? And so the way in which it's Spinoza's Amsterdam is that this is a moment of those questions being fronted by virtually any like engaged, active political person or thinker. And although he's not speaking to Jews, in like the voice is not towards Jews, and I think that he understands, in fact, I would say that he actively understands the context of a polity to be not a Jewish one. Mm-hmm. I think he knew that his former peers in his community did see themselves as having something like that. So I think that he also was aware, like part of the extent to which he's arguing that a Jewish context is one without a polity, because the political chosenness of Jews in the Bible has passed. So he's like, Jews have a polity, that's the content of the law. Now that the polity is gone, the law is not useful. The ceremonial law is not useful. And Jews can't say that they're chosen, right? In the context of just speaking to Christians, that has a certain meaning. But when you read the writings of his peers from those same moments, they were very much saying that they did have a polity still. And I think he probably knew that. So even though you're not seeing like direct, he's not quoting them and they're not quoting him, they're both taking up this question of what can it mean? Can it be that in the present day, Jews have something that is a polity, and that therefore the law that was for that polity has some continued relevance to self-government. And what is it?
So I'm going to read off a question, if that's okay. Mark wrote in, one of the writers on Spinoza, I forget whom, and the cherem against him has it that it was his going to the Dutch court to be declared a minor and not responsible for his father's debts that angered the rabbis, i.e. going to the state rather than their authority. What has your research shown about this idea?
My research, so I have not researched directly the reasons for Spinoza's excommunication. I'm aware of this argument. I actually think so my sense of the scholarship of that particular argument is that it is totally valid. The sources look right. It makes sense. It looks like he did that and that would have angered them. However, famously, this is not my observation, the cherem against Spinoza has a very different quality, different wording, different structure, different impact, different way of being recorded physically in the record book than almost all of the other cherems throughout the whole century. So it was very common. The cherem was actually in this community used really frequently just as a tool of governance. It was sort of like a fine. It was just like something that the lay leaders would impose when you were being recalcitrant, when you hadn't done what you were supposed to do as a member. They would bring you before them. They would give you an opportunity to fix it. If you didn't, you would be in cherem. Sometimes it was for a set period, a day or a week. Sometimes it was a blanket cherem, but then you'd come back a week later and pay your fine or apologize to whoever you defended, and then it was lifted, right? It was really like a functional piece of how the community ran. And that's another sort of just like, by the way, that's another way to think about the perspective on the cherem being really at the center of how they understand the authority of the community. But Spinoza's is, and so when those are recorded in the lay leader's record book, it's really, really businesslike, and it's matter of fact, and it's really quick. It's, a little thing like this, and it's like so-and-so appeared before the Mahamad, and it was decided that he's in cherem, and they like sign it, right? Spinoza's is like a whole page, and it's filled with the most I mean, you guys know this, but it's filled with the most intense mortal curses against his soul, and the accusations of sinning against the Jewish people, of heresy that is irremediable, that he persists in his evil action, right? Like the sense of him doing something that's wrong, deeply wrong, is unlike anything else that you see there. And so I think that the idea that he would have like gone to the state instead of the community to mediate something, for sure that was frowned upon, but also tons of people were doing it. Like lots of people went outside of the community in this, by the way, in this community, and also lots of other communities. Like we shouldn't imagine actually that pre-modern Jewish communities were sites of exclusive Jewish law, right? And so I just don't see that reflected. Like I don't see that as being the main reason for the term.
So this is fascinating, but I want to talk about you a little bit, if that's okay. Why did you pick this topic? What drew you to it? What made you interested in it? What?
That's such a good question that I wasn't expecting.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's great. I'll just think about it for a second. I have always been interested. I've always sought insight into the ways in which Jewish participation in wider culture raises questions that are specific to the Jewish experience. So, in other words, one way that I could have said that is, I've always been interested in the intersection between Jews and the wider culture. Okay, kinda, but really but on a deeper way, what I have found myself being really interested in is how Jews who are like fully part of the fabric of a place and its ways of experiencing the world and its pressing and urgent concerns, how the pressing and urgent concerns of the world they live in are creating new questions for them that are specific to them, and that then change the course of an internal Jewish like sort of line of Jewish tradition or Jewish thought. And I think this is a case where that's extremely true, right? These people were very connected to the non-Jewish world. I'm not actually going to say more so than lots of other Jews at other times, but they certainly were very connected to the non-Jewish world. And I think that the questions that began to preoccupy them because of the times that they lived in, whether it was the political times, whether it was Shabtai Tzvi and the messianic movement, whether it was the challenge of Christians saying that they were the new Israel and that they possessed the heritage of the biblical polity, right? Whatever those things are, which, by the way, well, I'll set that aside. Those challenges led them to really innovate and to really think some interesting new thoughts and raise interesting new questions that have lasted a long time. So I guess that's sort of the answer. The thing that I was just about to say is that this idea of, this is another case where this context, I feel like you can feel even in the present day, that Jews were like implicated in wider politics, especially Christian politics. The Christians were sort of pressing the idea of Jews and therefore the experience of Jews into their own disputes. And then Jews needed to both like react to it, but also to like be in it and to understand and to re-own the things that were being said about them.
Right. I think there are so many parallels to today and so many things you can look at today. So as I was looking at it, of course, we learn from history, but this, I think there's a lot to delve into. That was my last question. Did you?
I have many more questions, but maybe we have a small group today, but I think that maybe we can turn to them. And Dora, if you think that's okay, I don't know, just because we're coming up on almost 1 o'clock. And if there aren't other
Right,
questions,
if there are questions, please put them into the chat or Q&A.
yeah,
That's why
I'm happy to go. There's so many pieces here. Maybe as people are coming in and formulating their own questions, there's a lot of pieces here that are just so fascinating. You have a lot of images of the synagogue, of the synagogue, which anyone who's been to Amsterdam, anyone who goes to Amsterdam and doesn't go to the synagogue is a fool, I think. I'll just put that out there. It's one of really just a stunning building of universal importance, and that was true in its day. There's travelers who come and they say, "Oh, I managed to get there in time for services, on Saturdays, so I can see the synagogue." But can you talk to us a little bit about the synagogue, what it means, maybe politically? From not just the aesthetics, the religious piece of it, which I think a lot of people, may know about, but like, how do you, why do you bring it in? Why do you talk about it? I think it's brilliant to do so, but like, if you can kind of go there.
It's necessary, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, this is such a fun part. First of all, the experience of going to the synagogue today, and this is tied into my answer. One of the reasons it's so amazing is because you step into the courtyard. So the synagogue, the building itself, the synagogue, is a sort of tall building that stands inside a courtyard that's ringed by a kind of like it's like a three-sided donut of low outbuildings, right? So you're imagining a back one, right? That the synagogue, that the sanctuary building is at the center of a ring. And you step in and you sort of leave the world of 21st century Amsterdam and enter the world of 17th century Amsterdam. Like you're all of a sudden surrounded by even the sounds of the surrounding street, sort of quiet. The scale changes because you can only see. So it's really an experience, I feel like, of stepping back into time. So special. So everyone should go. But that courtyard, I think, is really important. So the argument that I make about the synagogue complex that was built in 1675 has a lot to do with the outbuildings and the courtyard, which is to say that, in my interpretation, the design there creates a kind of an instantiation or a reflection of that same model of the relationship between the political, or maybe in this case we could say the civic or the social on the one hand, and the religious, meaning the sacred, the holy, the ritual, on the other. By which I mean to say that the community as a whole, the Kal Kadosh Talmud Torah, this entity that's lay-run, lay-governed, sort of lay-functioning, is the civic or the social or the political, and it is surrounding and enclosing this important component of religious life and religious identity and the holy, right? And that's in the form of the sanctuary. So in the same way that the community is a kind of a civic sphere where Jews can participate as in a political sphere, right? The outbuildings and the courtyard form a kind of a physical civic space.
I'm going to share just so that people can see as you're.
Thank you so much. Great. Yeah, so it's hard to see in this picture the courtyard itself, but you can see.
That was the best courtyard I could get. I was looking.
Yeah. Well, if anybody wants to go get my book, there's really good images in there that show it clearly. And
these houses, right? I mean, those houses that you see from the street, they're part of those low buildings, right?
So the thing in the front, the very front of the image that we were just looking at, those are part of the complex. And those were all built at the same time as the sanctuary itself. And actually, in almost all of the contemporary images of the complex, the outbuildings are included.
Right.
And part of the reason why the whole thing is sometimes compared to the Temple of Solomon is not only because of it, but not only because of the architectural elements of the sanctuary building, but also because of this like walled space around it. Okay, so it looks like the basically like the space on the Temple Mount with the wall around it, the way that there you go.
Oh, excellent. Yes.
There you go. So the image at the top is the contemporary drawing of the synagogue complex as it was built and represented. You can see that the behind wall is a fictional one, but and then the image at the bottom here, Drew, if you just scroll down a little bit, this is the image of, this is an image of the Temple of Solomon that was
You see it
a
around.
contemporary understanding of what the temple looked like, right? So there's the wall around it is an important piece of that understanding in terms of echoing the temple, but it's also in images, it's important in that way. But in the book, I also argue from the evidence of a number of sermons that were delivered at the moment of the dedication of the new synagogue, the new complex. So when they finally opened it after 5 years of really a lot of like trials and tribulation trying to get this thing going, a lot of communal dispute, this is the moment that people were trying to secede. This is also just a few years after Shabtai Tzvi's
We didn't talk about it all, but people.
Yeah, so I'll bring it in 1 second. So it's just a few years after that, and Shabtai Tzvi himself is still alive, sitting writing letters to his followers in Amsterdam. It's been a tough few years, and in 1675, when they dedicate and open the synagogue, they had a week of public orations, and they made a beautiful commemorative volume of copies of those orations together with images. And a really pervasive theme in those, and especially in a couple of, but sort of throughout those orations, is the sense that not only that this is an amazing moment for Jewish religion and practice, that the community has like found a holy place to be, but rather that it's also an accomplishment on the part of the ma'amad, the lay leaders. And there's a lot of play on the idea that the complex, that the construction that's just been completed is a place for the ma'amad to rule. That it's a site in which they can realize the governance that they are doing. And so it's in partnership and it's in connection with the religious purpose, but they definitely talk a lot about being like, this is like the earthly palace to correspond to the divine one. And the ma'amad, the lay leaders, are in charge of the earthly palace. And God is in charge of the celestial one. So there's explicit language in that way that really calls attention to the idea that this is understood as a reflection of the community being not just a vehicle for religious expression, that the community is additionally something civic or political. Okay, so that's going on, and part of what I argue too is that not everyone in the community was buying into that. Essentially, that's great, that sounds awesome, but not everybody like agreed. And so some people didn't really want to be a part of a massive, incredibly expensive, extremely visible project that was going to glorify the ma'amad. And so there was fighting over it. And so I try to show that some of the fighting had directly to do with the building of the synagogue. In addition, it's really clear that the synagogue, that building such and investing in this way, in such a monumental piece of architecture, and specifically a monumental piece of architecture that includes this civic sphere, right at the moment where some people are still imagining that Shabtai Tzvi might come back, is itself its own message. And there, I think, the interpretation that I offer is that it is all some of the interest in Shabtai Tzvi and some of the interest in turning to the community as a site of Jewish politics is of a piece. In other words, both sides either looking to a restored Jewish king or emperor, as the case was going to be with Shabbatai Tzvi, and looking to a Jewish commonwealth in the diaspora. They're very, very different forms of Jewish politics with different kinds of people being in charge and very different ramifications in terms of how things might actually run. But both are coming from, both involve really an interest in and an expectation of Jewish like political self-realization, Jews inhabiting political identity and having a polity in which to operate as political humans. And so they're in competition in this moment, right? Shabbatai Tzvi is gonna, Sabbatianism is gonna draw people away from a lay leadership and away from local discrete diaspora communities. And the Esnoga and its complex are real, like doubling down on what it means to be embedded deeply in both the urban fabric and the political fabric of the diaspora.
And if I could, I work on the Atlantic and the Americas, and the amazing thing about the Esnoga in Amsterdam is that it gets repeated over and over again. It's part of this network of colonies and metropole that you see, obviously London, but that's another sort. But Jamaica, Curacao, Newport, everywhere you go, you get the same idea of like a monumental synagogue, which is the center of the community, that it has all the trappings of the original mothership, so to speak. And I never thought of it in those political terms. I always thought of it in much more sociocultural terms, a sense of identity, the same Siddur everywhere you go, the same practices, the same tunes, the same trained rabbis, right? But here you're giving a really new insight, at least for me, that I've been thinking about this for many years, of like, this is a way of saying we're a diasporic polity that has roots, that is strong, that that we don't need to be waiting for a Shabbatai Tzvi type of Messiah to come, and yet all the names, right, are often these very, very messianic names: Mikveh Israel, Sherit Israel, Netzah, right? So you get this.
You can read it as a kind of inversion, like an appropriation of that idea. Like we're going to take that longing and embed it where we are.
Right.
I also would say, I love that, Ronnie. That's beautiful. I also would say that, if I'm not mistaken, most of the later ones don't have the courtyard. So,
I believe, right. I'm trying to think.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think, so this is another piece, maybe this is a good sort of way to start bringing it to a conclusion, is the sort of like after story of all this is that to some extent, like it was so impactful in the world of ideas, but the idea that Jews could have a state within a state, which is what this eventually boils down to, almost immediately became impossible, right? Like there's a brief moment, which is where I'm looking in the 17th century, where you could have a commonwealth that was the way I described, like within other commonwealths or within a state or within or under a monarchy. Very soon, like even it starts with Hobbes and it gets more and more intense, the tolerance for having political units within political units with their own set rights and privileges disappears. And then we begin to get this narrative that a Jewish community that's self-ruled is problematic because it's a quote unquote state within a state, right? And so already before the turn of the 18th century, like before 1700, most of this discourse within the community also like totally settles out. Like I couldn't find any in the 90s, right? So
the same century, you're saying?
Yeah.
Since 1690.
Like by the end of the century. So most of this discourse is really within 20, 30 years. It's really like 1660 to the late 1680s. And then it, they'll occasionally like mention a republic later on, but it's very obviously metaphorical and sort of flowery and doesn't have the same literality, right? The literal sense that like what we were talking about is that Jews have a republic with a government. That's how the earlier sources sound, and doesn't have the same urgency. Like then it's just sort of a glorious thing to say. It's not part of more important claims. So I sort of see, you know, there was this flourishing of a particular way of understanding the community, and then I think it has long-lasting trails, right? For example, in the idea that a Jewish community is like a state, which then like modern historians take up, right? And in the Jewish questions about like whether they ought to have a polity in the, like what can a Jewish polity be like, even without overturning the exile, right? Like even the very idea that, right? So now that's not an unheard of idea, but really exploring and sort of grappling with what it means for Jews to have those things in a practical way. Right. So the ideas like have a long afterlife, but the actual moment of believing that like we're being able to say out loud, we Jews have a polity and it's this body, it's this government, I think goes away. So that's why we have this kind of special, you know, the special architecture of the Amsterdam synagogue complex that's not repeated.
I was trying to think, just a little detail. I'm pretty sure Jamaica, which is a much more modern building because of the earthquakes and fires there, has one. And I don't know about the others, but definitely Beth's Marks has it, but not the same. No one, but I don't think any of them have that same Azara sort of like setup with the little offices around and stuff. I think that's very unique to Amsterdam.
Right. There's plenty of other examples of, I mean, it would be silly to say no synagogues have courtyards. Like there's lots of situations where Jews have like a side yard or where they're sort of in an isolated place with a plaza next to them. Right. But the really specific, like, the language of this architecture is really clear, I think. And that's not repeated.
Right.
Thank you. Yeah, there's so much more to talk about, and there's I mean, like I said, we didn't even get into the Sabbatianism into detail, but we have to leave people wanting more, right? So
thank you guys. I feel like I just talked the whole time, but I guess that's
what we were supposed to do. No, this was great. But here, Nikki did make a comment on your Jamaica. Jamaica's last standing Sephardic synagogue in Kingston does in fact have a courtyard, yes. Also, a distinctive link among the Caribbean synagogues in Holland's and London's is, sand on the floor. Okay, but that's a totally different topic. We're not. So I want to say thank you for those who are watching us now, for those who are watching it in the future. And thank you so much for speaking with us today. This was really great. And to remind everybody, it's Jewish Politics in Spinoza's Amsterdam. So
thank you so much for having me. It was really lovely.
This was a great conversation. I enjoyed it. Bye.
You will. Thank you. Thank you, Drora. And Anne, have a wonderful time in Yerushalayim. Enjoy. Give my best to all my friends.
I will for sure.
Yes. Okay.